Maseches Yevamos Daf Kofei continues the Gemara's analysis of the halachas of chalitza, the 3 steps that are included in chalitza. We'll be speaking about if you did only one of them, does it have any effect? We'll talk about if you did some of them wrongly or improperly or in extenuating circumstances, is there a way to do them? What happens if you did them out of order? And some other questions analyzing the Mishnah, which we've just read. Now, along the way, the Gemara will bring 2 well-known Agadata Gemaras, one about the fate of the house of Eli Cohen, and the other, the incident with the dispute between Rav Yishmael ben Rav Yossi and Avdan, Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So, by way of introduction, we're discussing the steps of Chalitza. We know that there are 3 things. There's the reading of the Parsha, where she first says Me'ein Yevami, and then at the end where we all say Kacha Yeyasa Leish. So after her first reading, we then have the chalitza removal of the shoe, then we have the spitting, and then the last reading. So the Gemara's question is, if you did just one of them, does it have any effect? And there's 3 possible halachos. One could be that it has 0 effect, nothing changed. Another could be is that it has an effect l'chumra only. It puzzles the woman to be able to do yibum from here on, but it doesn't free her l'shuk. And then the best effect would be if she is puzzled to the yibum and she's free to the shuk. So Gemara is discussing the opinion of Rabbi Kiva, and the Gemara has said that we seem to have held up till now that if you just do rikika, it has no effect. If she just spits, that has 0 effect. Now the Gemara wants to prove that it's not true. Rabbi Kiva holds that it has an effect. So the Gemara quotes a brisa. The brisa, we don't know necessarily who wrote it until we analyze it, but the brisa says, what if you left out 2 out of the 3 parts of chalitza? You only did 1. So the brisa says, if you did the most significant to the least significant, what's the halacha? If you did chalitza, the removal of the shoe, but you didn't do rikika or kriya, you didn't do spitting or reading, that's a kosher chalitza. That implies that it's fully kosher, and she's free to the shuk. If she did rikika, that's the somewhat of an action, not a complete action. It's not an action that the woman, that the Yevama does to the Yevam. It's just an action that the Yevama herself does. So if you do just the rikika, we didn't do chalitza or kriya, so there the halach is that it's psula. Psula, the Gemara proves, means that it passes her to do yibum from now on, but she's also not mutter to the shuk until the chalitza is completed properly. The Gemara proves this because otherwise it wouldn't be a chiddush in saying psula that she's puzzled to marry to the shuk. That's pashat. If you didn't do chalitza, I wouldn't need a mishnah or a brisa to tell me that. So psula therefore means that she's puzzled to do yibam, but she is not free to go to the shuk. If she just did kriya that has no action, but she didn't do rikika or chalitza, there it has 0 effect, and she's still mutter to do yibam should they decide to do so afterwards. Now the Gemara says, who is the author of this mishnah? It cannot be Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer says if she did just chalitza, Rabbi Eliezer would not say that is kosher. Impossible. Rabbi Eliezer holds that the rikika, the spitting, is considered to be a full-fledged maisa, and that's essential. We've already seen that he holds that that's no good without rikika. So it's definitely not Rabbi Eliezer, because the brisa says if he did just chalitza, that's a kosher chalitza. If he did just the removal of the shoe, that's a kosher chalitza. So it's got to be Rabbi Kiva, and you see, it clearly holds that if you did just rikika, it does create a psul. That's different than what we said earlier, that Rabbi Kiva holds that if you do just chalitza, it does create a if you do just rikika, it does not create a psul. Here you see clearly that if you do just rikika, it does create a psul and has to be Rabbi Kiva. Now this is all based on a halacha said by Shmuel's father, Avud Shmuel, that just a rikika does not create a psul. Now the Gemara says there's another version of what Avud Shmuel actually said, but before that, the Gemara just wants to say, in Rabbi Kiva's opinion, why should there be a difference between rikika and kriya? The spitting and the reading. Both of them Rabbi Kiva considers to be non-actions. The only thing he considers to be an action is the removal of the shoe. So why should there be a difference between the two? Why should rikika alone create a psul while kriya alone does not create a psul? Somewhere says the reason is because there's 2 kriyas. There's one at the beginning and there's one at the end. But rikika is always done after chalitza. If rikika doesn't create a psul to puzzle her from marrying the brothers from doing yibum, what's going to happen will be is that if somebody sees a woman do the rikika, because it only happens after chalitza, he'll assume that the chalitza already happened. If the halacha is that she can then go do yibum, he will learn the halacha that a woman who did chalitza is allowed to do yibum. Of course, that's asar, that's an isser shesach. So we can't allow Rikika alone to have Yibam following it, because people will assume that there was a Chalitza. However, the Kriya could be before the entire procedure. So if somebody sees a woman do Kriya and then do Chalitza, and then do Yibam, he won't assume that they did Chalitza already and learn that you can do Yibam after Chalitza. He'll assume that this was the Kriya that goes before the Chalitza, and the reason she could do Yibam is because she didn't do Chalitza yet. That's why you don't need to make Gzeira on just Kriya that it creates a psul, but you do need to make Gzeira on just Rikika that it creates a psul. Now, the other version of Avu de Shmuel is that it's not that he said that just Rikika creates a psul. He said that just Rikika is fine if it's out of order. So if you have a situation where a Yevama did Rikika first, she could do Chalitza afterwards, and she doesn't have to do Rikika again. That's what he said. Now, there was an incident that happened where somebody came before Rabbi Ami, and Rabbi Amma Bar Mamo was sitting there, and she did Rikika before Chalitza. So Rabbi Ami said, okay, do Chalitza now and send her home. So Rabbi Abba asked, what do you mean? But she has to do Rikika now. Rikika is supposed to go after Chalitza. He said she already did Rikika before Chalitza. So she doesn't have to do it again. So the question was, why does she just do Rikika again? What's the problem? Let her do Rikika again. So she did Rikika already once. Do it again. Do it in the right order. We know that there's a halacha that everything's supposed to be in the correct order. There's supposed to be Kisidron. So Gemara says that there's a problem, though. There's a potential problem that'll happen if you do Rikika twice. And that's, if you do Rikika twice, we'll learn from there that the first Rikika didn't count as anything. It had zero effect. If that happens, then you'll have a case where a woman will do Rikika, just one Rikika, and we'll assume it had zero effect, and therefore she's allowed to do Chalitza afterwards. If that happens, people will see that she did just a Rikika, that is, people will matter to do Yibam afterwards, correction. Now, if that happens, people do a Yibam after a Rikika, because they learned falsely from this, that a Rikika has zero effect, then what will happen is that someone will see that there was a Rikika followed by a Yibam. He'll assume that Rikika must have been after a Chalitza, because Rikika is supposed to be after Chalitza. He'll assume the Chalitza happened too. He'll then assume that the Yibam is okay after Chalitza, which is a terrible wrong halacha. That's Eshesach, Isra Eshesach. Now the Gemara says that Rabbi Abba assumed that he was just being pushed away. This wasn't a real answer. It sounds like a bit far-fetched. But he went and he looked and he found a brisa that says that doing it in proper order is not ma'akev, whether the chalitza is for the rikika or the rikika is for the chalitza. It still counts. It works b'diavad. And now the Gemara brings three questions that were asked to Levi. Two of them related to Yibam, and the other one will launch us into an agadata. So Levi went to check out his fields. The Gemara says Levi was a Levi, so he lived in the cities of Levium, but he did have some interests. And while he was on the way, they asked him three things. They asked him, a woman without hands, can she do chalitza? Rashi says she would pull off the shoe with her teeth. Someone who spits, the Yevama who spits, and she spits blood instead of saliva, is that a kosher chalitza? And the third thing is, what is meant by the pasuk in Sefer Daniel, where it says, Aval agedach esarashim b'ksav emes. The Malach says, I'm going to tell you what's written, what was decreed in Shemayim, in the truthful writings, in Ksav Emes. What does that mean, Ksav Emes? I mean, in Shemaim there's not Emes Ksav? What could that be? So Gemara says Levi didn't know, so they went and asked in the Beis Medrash, and they were told as follows. It says, do chalitza, it doesn't say chalitza b'yad, so it's fine if you find some other way to pull it off. It says to spit, it doesn't say to spit saliva, so it's fine if she spits blood. As far as what the pasuk means, there are two types of Ksav and Shemaim, the two types of Gzar Din, two types of decrees. One is with a shvua, one is without a shvua. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes a shvua, he's going to do something, you can't cancel that decree. And that's not called Ksav Emes. That's called Ksav Emes. If there's no shvua, it's cancelable, it can be repealed, therefore it's not necessarily called Ksav Emes. Says Gemara, what's an example of a Ksav that can't be repealed with a shvua? So Gemara says that was the decree on the house of Eli HaKohen that it was going to be destroyed, and everyone who was descended from him was going to die young. Pasuk there says, I swore, if Eli's, meaning it will not, Eli's sin will not be atoned for with karbanos, not a carbon animal or carbon mincha. Nothing more comments on this. Rabbah says it can't be atoned for with a carbon chatas or carbon with a carbon or a mincha, but it could be atoned by learning Torah. Abai says it could be atoned by gemilas chasadim. Now we have this spelled out. The Gemara says that Rabbah and Abaye. Now there's a question here if the Gemara says Rabbah or Rava. Rava was not a Kohen, So if it's Rava, if we're going to say that Rava is descended from the house of Eli, it would have to be through his mother. Machlokes Rishonim who it is. But Rabba or Rava and Abaye both came from Eli, the Gemara says, and Rabba learned the Torah, and therefore he lived to be 40 years old, which is older than most people from Beis Eli. Abaye did Torah and Gemilas Chasadim, he lived to be 60 years old. Gemara brings a brisa. There was one family in Yerushalayim that they all used to pass away at age 18. They came and they discussed it with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He said, you're probably descended from Eli HaKohen, where it says, everyone in your house is going to die young. Therefore, the cure for this situation is learn a Torah and you'll live. So make sure to learn a lot of Torah before your 18th birthday. So they went and they did it. They followed his advice and they did live to ripe old age, and they called the family Mishpachas Yochanan, because Yochanan ben Zakkai is the one who made it live long. Now, the Gemara says that Rav Shmuel bar Unya said in the name of Rav, how do you know that a Gzar Din on the congregation is not signed? The Gemara interrupts, Gzar Din is not signed? What do you mean? It says, Ki im techavsi b'neser v'tarbi l'chaburis nechtam avoynech. The pasuk in Yirmiyah clearly says that your sin is signed. So there is a signature on Gzar Din Shel Tzibur. Where it says, no, how do you know that even though it's signed, it can still be torn up if it's on the tzibur? That's my question. Where it says, you have two contradicting psukim. Can you have atzlacha in your tefillah at any time or only certain times? On the one hand, it says, Mik Hashem Elokeinu b'chol kareinu elav, who is like Hashem, we can always call to him. On the other hand, it says, Dirish Hashem b'himatzos, seek him out when he is found, only during certain times. Where it says, the difference obviously must be whether it's a yachid or a tzibur. An individual alone needs to come at the right time. That's b'himatzos. A tzibur can come at any time, and therefore they can have their decree torn up, and that fits with what we said earlier. So the Gemara says, what is the time that a yachid can come? The Gemara says it's the 10 days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, Sarsi Mechuva. That's the Dir Hashem Behimatzo. The Gemara now goes back to the statements of Avua de Shmuel. The Gemara says he has a comment on the question we were just discussing as to whether or not if she spits blood, does that count as a kosher spitting so you can continue with chalitza or not? So Avua de Shmuel says, look, every time she spits blood, there's going to be some saliva mixed in there, so you don't need to worry about whether or not spitting of blood counts, because there's also spitting of saliva. The says, I have proof that that's not true. The halacha is that a flow from one of the fountains of a zav creates tama. So if a zav spits saliva, that is metame, or if he urinates or has a flow from the ama, that is also metame. These are called mayonos hazav. What about if he has blood coming out of his mouth or out of his ama, out of his male organ? So the Gemara brings a limud that is not metame. It says zovo tame ve'in dam hayotze mi pivum pi ama tame. It's only an actual natural fluid that comes out there, not blood. So the Gemara says, according to Avua de Shmuel, every time he spits blood, he's got to be spitting saliva too. So how is there a possibility to say that it's not metame? So the Gemara says there's two different types of ways that blood can come out. It can be spit with force, or it can just dribble out. If it dribbles out, it doesn't necessarily have saliva, and that's what this Mishnah is referring to when it's telling me that the blood itself is not matame. Avua de Shmuel is talking about where it's spit. There's got to be some saliva involved with it as well. And now we refer back to the Mishnah and discuss a number of the halachas in there. So one that we saw was that a cheresh who does chalitza, it is psula. It's not a good chalitza. So the Gemara says this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, but the Chachamim say it doesn't count for anything at all. Rabbi Meir holds that it apostles her from doing yibum going forward, but the Chachamim say it's a 0. Now, if a ketana does chalitza, Rabbi Meir holds the opposite halacha. Now, the first halacha, which the Gemara just said, the Gemara quotes the statement about the cheresh in the Mishnah, but it's referring to a katan. Now we're referring to a ketana, that's if the Yevamo was a child. So there we had seen that it's also a chalitza psula. The Gemara says this is again the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who holds that the ketana, the Yevamo, also has to be a gedol, she has to be an adult. However, the Chachamim here hold the opposite halacha. They hold that she doesn't have to be an adult at all. It's a perfectly good lichatchila chalitza, even though she's a child. Now, what's the source of this halacha? So we know that in the parsha it says ish. He uses the word ish to describe the yavam, therefore he has to be an adult. Rabbi Meir holds we make a hekesh between ish and isha. It talks about the yavama, and therefore we put her together with the ish, and they both have the same halachas. She also has to be an adult. Chacham say no such hekesh. She can be a child. There's no problem. Now the Gemara says, who are the Chachamim here that hold that it's not a problem? It's Rabbi Yosi. And the Gemara brings a lengthy story, which has a number of other things in it, but which will illustrate this halacha as well in the name of Rabbi Yosi. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe were sitting at the entrance of one of them. We're sitting at the door of one of the two, we don't know which one, and they were discussing tefillah. Where should one put his eyes? Where should one look when he's being mispalel? So, should he look down at the ground of Eretz Yisrael? That would be a fulfillment of the pasuk that said, "V'hayu einai v'libi sham kol hayamim." My eyes and my heart will always be towards the ground of Eretz Yisrael. The other opinion was that I should lift up to Shemayim, like it says, "Nisa levavenu al kapayim." El kel b'shamayim. We should lift up our hearts to Shemayim. So what should you do? So Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosi walked up then and he said, what are you discussing? They said, tefillah. He said, my father, Rabbi Yosi, said that when you bring mispal, his eyes should be down to the ground of Eretz Yisrael and his heart should be up to Shemayim. That way you fulfill both psukim. You do the Eini Sham and you do the Libi El Kel Bashamayim. Now, as they were talking, Rabbi came to the yeshiva in order to say the shir. It was time for the shir, so they went in to take their seats. Now, the first two, Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe, were light, and therefore they sat in their place. Rabbi Shmuel had to walk to his seat because he was heavy, and therefore he needed to be in a specific spot. So he had to walk between the rows of the Talmidim who were already seated because they came in late because they were having this conversation. So Avdan, who was one of the Talmidim of Rebbe, saw Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi walking, and he was walking between the rows of Talmidim seated on the floor. It looked as if he was stepping on their heads, and Avdan felt that it was a chutzpah. So he said, who is this guy who thinks he can step on the heads of the holy Klal Yisrael of Am Kadosh? So Rabbi Shmuel said, I am Yishmael ben Rabbi Yosi, and I came to learn Torah from Rebbe. And that was a justification. So Avdan responded, he said, are you fitting to learn Torah from Rebbe? You think you're on a madrega to learn Torah from Rebbe? So he said, was Moshe fitting to learn Torah from Piyag Vur, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu? He said, well, you think you're Moshe? He said, well, you think your Rebbe is Hashem? This was a conversation that went on. The Gemara says that Rav Yosef says over that Rebbe punished Avdan for this. There's a number of things he did wrong. First of all, he was Mitzayer Rabbi Shimon. He was Mitzayer Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi. He insulted him for apparently no reason. But second of all, he was called Rabach, and he did not protest. He said, "V'chi Rabach Elokim." He didn't protest and say that he's your Rebbe as well. Okay, now the Gemara continues. So the Gemara says that while this was all happening, a Yevama came in and she approached Rebbe that she needed Yibum. So Rebbe told Avdan, go check and see if she is a Gedola. We know that you need to be an adult. She needs to be an adult. Check, find out if she's if she has the signs of godless. So it says, when they left, Rabbi Shmuel said to Rebbe, my father, Rabbi Yosi, Paskin, that a woman does not have to be an adult. Only the man has to be an adult. So Rebbe accepted that psak and he said, call them back. We don't need him to check if she's an adult. The elder, Rabbi Yosi, has already ruled you don't have to have an adult. So then Avdan came back and he had to walk between the rows. And he was, as it were, stepping on everybody's head. So Rabbi Shmuel said, he who was needed by Klal Yisrael, referring to himself, who was able to say over this psak from his father, he can step on everybody's head. But him who is not needed by Klal Yisrael, referring to Avdan, who was useless in this incident, he certainly shouldn't be stepping on everyone's head. The Rebbe said to Avdan, Taka, stop where you are and sit over there. Now, at that time, Avdan got Saras, his two sons drowned, and his two daughters-in-law did miyun, they pulled out of the marriage. This was all an onesh for what he had committed here. Nachman Yitzchak said, Baruch Rachmana, bless Hashem, that took the punishment from Avdan in this world, and he did not have to go up to the next world with any issues. Now, the Gemara says that Rav Ambi said, from the words of Rebbe, we learn that a ketana, from the words of Rebbe Yosi, that is, who the Gemara calls Baribi, we learn that a ketana could do chalitza from a young age. It would assume that she has to be old enough to know what's going on, so she has to be about 6 or 7. Rava said she has to be onas nadam, she has to be at least a year before bas mitzvah, so I guess age 11. And the halacha l'maisa of the Gemara is we need her to be a gedola. We need her to have 2 saros. We don't go with the slach at all. We go with the psak of Rabbi Meir. All right, referring back to the Mishnah, there we saw that there were 2 opinions. There were 2 people who held that chalitza is kosher if only 2 people were presiding over it, not the normally required 3. So Gemara says that Rav Yosef, Rav Yibin, and Rav Nachman said that this halacha is not like that. 2 is pasul. It's no good. So Gemara says we already had statements of Rav Yosef, Rav Yibin, and Rav Nachman to say that you require 3. Why do you need both of them? So Gemara said you need both to show me that 3 is required both l'chatchila and b'diavad. You need to show me that 3 is l'chatchila and you don't need more. You don't need 5. That's why they had to say that 3 are required, that's l'chatchila. And here they had to tell me that even b'diavad it's no good. You would think 3 might be okay b'diavad, but here, and this was a b'diavad scenario, and they're telling you that the halacha is not like the one who says that it is good. Alright, next we saw the Mishnah had said that there was a story that somebody did chalitza on his own with no one presiding. So the Gemara asks, how did we know about it? The Gemara says witnesses saw from outside. They were indoors. Witnesses saw from outside. So they don't count as presiding, but they could at least testify that it happened. And Mishnah said that the story came before Rabbi Akiva in a prison, and he allowed it. So Gemara said, well, 1 second. The story was in a prison, and Rabbi Akiva allowed it out of prison? Or the story was out of prison, and Rabbi Akiva allowed it in a prison? Meaning, what's the application over here? The Gemara says that they were both in a prison. The story happened in a prison, and Rabbi Akiva allowed it to happen again in the extenuating circumstances of a prison, that is okay to do chalitza with no one presiding.